Now we're going to have our first conversation. We're going to bring up the first group that's going to start thinking about these, or actually talk a little bit about what have they learned, where would they go, and a question that they're wrestling with. And they can talk around that as well. But the point is we're going to give a little stimulating 5-minute burst, and then we're going to have a little conversation amongst them, and then we're going to have a conversation with you. So right now, let's have up our first group here, which is John Battelle, Sarah Sutton-Fell, Paul Sappho, and Vivian Ming. And what we're going to do is we're all going to sit up here snug as we're videoing here. But we're each going to do individually be able to talk. And John is going to be the first person to talk here. He has a company called NewCo. He's been bringing together a new kind of company around missions and trying to talk media through that. And he actually had an amazing conference, NewCo Shift Forum, earlier this year, in which he pulled together people from the policy world, people from the tech world, to actually start wrestling with some of these issues. And we're hoping that you can distill some of that about what you know for us here. Thanks.
I think the biggest problem we have when addressing this whole thing is our addiction to the Protestant work ethic. The entire conversation, particularly in this country, but I think in sort of Western countries in particular, is that we sort of live and die and exist and understand ourselves through what we understand to be work. And in conversations with Tim, actually, a few years ago, kind of got me thinking about, wait a minute, maybe work isn't supposed to be work. Maybe work is supposed to be an expression of joy and connection. And I can't imagine our, Western civilization, particularly the United States, embracing that. And I think we should. I think we have an opportunity, thanks to technology, which I've been involved in covering for 30 years now, which is terrifying, that we actually have an opportunity as a society to think a lot bigger than we have thought in the past 50 to 100 years about what's possible with how we spend our time. And I think the comment that was made about motherhood and parenting is very, very salient. I mean, that's work. Why do we think of that as work? But people actually argue on the behalf of parents because they need to go do that job of being a parent. We're using the wrong grammar and the wrong vocabulary and the wrong social conversation. So I think the biggest thing that we might do is try to create a conversation and a social movement around our right as human beings to see kind of the work thing solved and to move on, and decide what is it and how is it we spend our time, given that we figured out the solution to the basic stuff like paying for things. And so I think shifting off of that from work to, yes, we want to do things that make us feel connected and part of the world. That's great. We absolutely do want to do that. But why do we need to call it a job? Why can't we call it what we do, our life? And so one of the things we do at NewCo is we explore companies that have a new approach to work. Is that I noticed, particularly in technology companies, and certainly Pete and I worked at Wired, that we had absolutely no distinction between what we love to do and what we were actually doing. And to us, it was a mission, it was a calling, it was a purpose. We made this thing because it needed to exist. We wanted it to exist. It was a celebration of our collective energies. And I noticed that there were more and more and more companies like that, not initially in the Valley, and then around the world, all over the place. These companies started just because founders and just wanted to do this, this work. And it was between life and work, there was not that much distinction because everyone was running around saying work-life balance, But it's actually, no, it's life, work, and work is life. And so how can we get to that point? You showed all those great pictures of those presidents that were reflective of an era that it was a significant shift. Each of them, I would argue, maybe not Obama, actually had humongous, bold policy, agendas that changed how we thought about our society. We have not had the courage to do that yet. We're not there. Obama couldn't get it done. I mean, I think ACA was pretty cool because it was outcomes-based, and that's a big part of what we're thinking about. But at the end of the day, no, we didn't get it done. We've still got it ahead of us. And I think we need to have a conversation that frames what that policy shift will be. And basic income is a start, but I don't think it's the whole deal. And I'll cede my rest to the other senators.
Well, so if you thought of a question that you would like to talk about tonight, as an example, is it rooted in that question?
I think, the third question of your questions would be how do we find the will in our current political society to go boldly and to think really big thoughts. We have a new congressman from Silicon Valley who came in not expecting to basically spend his first 5 months, defending how he can't get anything done because of Trump. But he came in on an earned income tax credit plan that was $1 trillion plan. That's a fundamental rethink of our tax code. Those are the kinds of ideas we need to be actually having a conversation about, but we're not. But how can we get the conversation to that level?
Perfect, and perfect timing. All right.
Awesome.
We're going to go to Sarah Sutton-Fell where you can actually why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do as you jump into your kind of 5-minute segment here as well.
My company, FlexJobs, has been working in the flexible workspace, so I see everything, including the future of work with independent workers, through that lens. And that can mean telecommuting and remote work. It can mean freelance, part-time, flexible schedule, alternative schedule. Certainly parents and working parents are a big part of that, but really people want and need work flexibility for a lot of different reasons. All walks of life. And so as I think of the future of work for independent workers, I do look at it through this lens. And while it's something that we all need, I think that the delineation, as you were talking about, between work and life is something actually, and also the delineation that we've really experienced for everyone, but freelancers feel it more acutely and with more cumulative effects, I think, or I worry, because they really are the ones who are pushing the envelope and working anywhere and anytime they want, 24/7. I think probably everyone in the Valley, and most people in the Valley are very susceptible to that, but freelancers are really living it, and I think that delineation it has to be something that we address and really teach people and educate workers and not to forget themselves, and in some ways, they have to protect the asset of themselves, and I really worry that we're not addressing that right now. I would say that one of the things when we go to the questions that I've been thinking about in the last year that I've learned are that things are changing very quickly and that the assumptions are being challenged. I consider I work in this industry, but just last week I was on a phone call in which my assumptions about the freelance economy were really challenged. I was talking to a leading co-working space, and I've spoken with a lot of co-working spaces over the years, and my general understanding from those calls is about 30% of their audience are freelancers, and so it's kind of a community, a place that people go, a support system. They're working to create an environment for networking and questions for either new freelancers or current freelancers, but they were telling me that actually only 5 to 7% of their workers now, or their audience now, are freelancers. It's all SME and business to business, which made me realize that here I've been going along assuming this, and it hasn't been that long. I mean, I've been having these conversations over the last few years pretty regularly, and it's something that still stop looking or stop asking the question constantly, and something fundamentally has changed. I was kind of assuming that those types of organizations would be ones that would be resources for freelancers, and it seems like actually it made me question, and actually I was brainstorming with the person, so questioning how are we going to support freelancers and really educate them about the protecting, coming up with boundaries and being able to figure out all of the different logistics and responsibilities that come along with being a freelancer versus being an employee, in which you are taken care of a little bit more. One of the other questions, I believe, was about kind of what we see now as opportunities, and I would say that legislation is a very big one. Policy work in those areas is very important. If you're a freelancer or an employer, you realize that there's a lot of gray between defining who is a freelancer and who's an employee, and there's pros and cons to either of those. Certainly quite a few cons for employers to classify people as employees versus freelancers, but it's something that legislative side has to be clarified. I also, because I work in remote work, and that overlaps quite a lot with freelancers, there's some very big issues with double taxation that happen. I think on the legislative side, that's another area that really needs to advance in order to incent both freelancers and employers to look at those flexibilities. And then I think the last one was about hybridization. For me, one of the questions that I would love to learn and discuss with many of you is about the hybridization of the workforce. Not just employee freelance, but also remote and on-site, and flexible schedule and FaceTime. And how do we navigate that? It's happening every day for employers. I was having a conversation earlier, right before this, about how a lot of the big companies have come out against remote work, for example. We all work remotely. All of these big companies, including Yahoo and Google and IBM, everybody works remotely in this room, whether it's 5% of your role, 10%, 20, 50, et cetera. But these are kind of acknowledgments that we have to formalize and be aware that it's not all or nothing. This is a hybridized workforce that we're looking towards. So
your question would be like, how can we evolve, take that hybrid form and formalize it in some way, or get it more robust or more kind of acknowledged?
I mean, what are people seeing and hearing? I mean, the hybridization factor is something there's so much fear around, and getting it adopted and formalized into companies has to happen faster. There are security risks for companies not to do it. There are practical reasons of recruiting and retention. There's gonna, I mean, the innovative companies are gonna acknowledge that our workforce has changed. It's not the same as 50 years ago, and the way we work has to be formalized into supporting that, otherwise we're gonna drive ourselves in the ground.
I like it, and okay, the hybrid factor. We're gonna move to Paul Sappho. Paul, you can introduce yourself, because I don't know how to explain you. You've had so many different ways to go.
Right. No. There's this thing called the web, and like you can look up my name, and that picture of me in the post office, that was a day when I was tired and distracted. I will say one qualification on behalf of the entire panel. The one thing we all share in common is that we're friends of either Pete or the organizers, and we all promptly responded to the invite to attend, and they gently told us, well, actually, you're not qualified to be in the audience. Well, we'll find a space for you. So, you know, we're just here to fill a little bit of time. We were given the assignment about 5 minutes before this started, the details. And so I'm going to take it to heart and actually answer the 3 questions directly. So question 1 was, what have you learned? I've been looking at issues in this space for a very long time, since before, well, never mind. And most recently, 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, I was part of a team at our Center for Advanced Study at Stanford. We did a year-long project looking at the question of what is the future of the work and what is the shape of the landscape. One of the lessons I've learned is always be sure you are asking the right question. And in general, whatever the dominant question is in the zeitgeist is almost nearly always the wrong question. 10 years ago, 12 years ago, I was looking at the question of, will robots steal our jobs? It was an intriguing little question then. It's an absolutely idiotic question today. The future of work was a top-line question 5 years ago, 4 years ago. I don't think it's a terribly productive question now. That's why I love the theme of the evening, which is on the focus of what's the future of workers. And in fact, I think the interesting questions have split into 2, down to the tactical implementation level of future of workers and upwards to what kind of economy. The big question is, what kind of economy do we want to build in a world of that's occupied by increasingly ubiquitous automation and robots? The second thing I've learned or been reminded is robots do not steal our jobs. CEOs steal jobs. Corporations, and they steal jobs by automating the wrong thing. Too often we use technology to pave the cow paths, to do some idiotic old thing more efficiently, or do some unbelievably stupid thing that we never could do before. Like shareholder value. That idea caught on in the 1980s because we had the technology, data technology, to say, wow, we could focus 100% on shareholders and let's forget about employee value, consumer value, community value, and the like. And Pete, by the way, that slide, the split happened at that moment in 1985. And I can still remember my conversation with the CEO of Procter & Gamble at the time saying, this thing doesn't make sense, but that's another story. Second question, where to go in the next year? This is a really interesting moment. It's a moment of inversion. Back in the 1960s and up into the 70s and until shareholder value, the safe place for a worker was to be in a large company. That's where job security was. And we all know that today the safe place to be is in a small company, not a large company, or better yet, to be on your own. That's why focusing on the future of the worker is absolutely the right question at the right moment. The second thing we need to do is make sure that stakeholders appreciate that the possibility space ahead is actually larger than people assume. Your third question, what's one question? I'll give you 4 fast. 1 is now different. I am not convinced it is. As part of our project at Stanford, I read all of the literature written in the last 150 years on the future of jobs, works, and automation. The single most cogent thing written in 100 years was the article that Pete quoted, John Maynard Keynes, 1932, Economic Possibilities for Grandchildren. You can just forget everything else afterwards. The second question I think we need to ask is, does empathy and interdependence scale? We know that social media is messing with those things. The key thing to building a new economy around meaning and the like is, do those things scale? And in conclusion, we have to remember that technology overwhelms us not by closing off options, but overwhelming us with possibilities. If we do this right, we have the chance to build a new landscape that is full of meaning and security and all the things we want, or we can build a new intellectual tiger cage and just really destroy, do shareholder value to the cubed. Which the one thing I would say as we go into the conversation, remember, everybody in this room, we are, by virtue of being here, we're in a privileged position, and we have to be careful about the let them eat cake thing. Now, we really do have options and opportunities here. And of course, saying that in the midst of all this job insecurity, I do feel a little bit like John Jacob Astor, who, while sitting in the bar of the SS Titanic, was heard to remark, "I know I asked for ice, but this is ridiculous." However, I think the other danger is, to use an oceanic metaphor, we have to be very careful in this moment of choice and options that we do not stand on a whale and fish for minnows.
That's a good way to leave this. Vivian, again, I think it's best for you to introduce yourself as well as, but I will say one of the reasons we love to have you in this mix is your understanding of AI and also some of the themes that would emerge from that. But go ahead.
Gosh, how to introduce myself, and I've only got 5 minutes. So it's interesting, you talked about how, for most of us here, John talked about, we are driven to do our work, we're passionate about it. When my wife and I are in bed at night, we're talking about education policy. I mean, enthusiastically, the way maybe other people talk about Game of Thrones. Mm-hmm. We're incredibly boring to most people, but we are passionate about it. It would be great, instead of going to a conference and people saying, "So who are you with?" They said, "So what's your purpose?" My purpose, to answer your question, is to build better people, which could sound very scary, and fair enough. But this for me ranges from my work as a neuroscientist, to work with parents, with kids, looking at entrepreneurs. Again, all of my work has to do with machine learning and massive scale data. Looking at what we might call the disenfranchised on-demand worker, as well as the sort of highly empowered, more traditional gig type thing that many of us might be thinking about. In that context, gosh, there's so many things to be said, but to riff off the two of them, what I see in my data is that there's a lot of different populations that are making up an on-demand economy or a gig economy. This is an aside, but I remember how passionately people talked about the on-demand economy and quoted, Travis and others about the economic importance of sharing all of this stuff. And then Uber offered me a job to be their chief scientist to build self-driving cars. And you realize, wow, that was all bullshit, wasn't it? As soon as you have a chance to find a cheaper way to supply your product, you were cutting out the sharing economy in a second. So, but when I look at this, I think about the human side of this, which is interesting because I look at AI, but the same thing plays out, which is what I see is an increasing split amongst this workforce. It's people that are already empowered, and we could characterize the kind of constructs, psychological constructs and others that are predictive of personal success and economic success and health success. And we see this very big shift. It played out in whatever the traditional economy is, but now we're seeing it playing out even more strongly here because the vast majority of the employees or workers or whatever you want to call them, none of them surely represented here, they don't possess these qualities. They could, they ought to. We need to own the fact that they don't, but they don't. And if you think that 80% of our workforce will just go out and become lifelong learners because it's in their best interest, you are in for disaster. If you think that they will make these long-term rational decisions about their economic futures simply because they really ought to, you know, or if we give them a universal basic income, that will actually solve the fundamental human problem, which is we've written them all off already. And we're not investing them from the day they're born. And we're not investing in their parents. And it's just those of us here that have been lucky enough to win the genetic lottery and end up with families that raised us into being the people we are. And yes, some of us here surely overcame some amazing obstacles, but you are the outliers. Don't argue by anecdote. We're missing a huge percent of the global population in this discussion. And that doesn't mean that this doesn't work for all the rest of us that are already passionate, that are already well structured for this economy. But we can't just go along with the magical thinking that if we give everyone a basic income, they'll all become artists and scientists. Listen, we don't pay artists and scientists shit anyway, so if they wanted to be, they'd already be. And if the access to information around the world, you know, everyone's got the smartphone in their hands is like the differentiator, then why don't we have to beat people off with sticks to get into a library, right? This is not how we build people. But this is the big question I'm going to leave with, which is how do we make that change so that we are? And I'm telling you, it's not just about throwing money at early education programs, but there is a step in that direction. For example, and I'll throw this out as a close, I'm involved in this company, and I'm not going to sell them here, but we have a massive on-domain workforce. And my involvement in them is figuring out not what is the right match between one of their specialists and a shift, what is the right series of shifts across the time we believe they will be with us at this company that will actually lift them up and out of our workforce. It's a totally for-profit company, but we get more money, the higher value work that they do, and as they move up, their chance of getting a long-term job increases. Their chance of actually developing the kind of skills that are going to carry them forward increases. And this is the sort of thing we need to think about. How do we turn the work itself into the development of that person?
Awesome, great question. Now it goes to you folks. We got about 15 minutes here. They teed up a lot of interesting things.
Hi, I'm Michael Perlmutter. I'm an inventor. I have a bunch of patents, mostly in telecommunications, some in finance. Vivian?
Ooh, yeah.
There were many things that the whole panel said that were interesting, and I think that were valuable. But the last thing you said was what really inspired me. And I think that at core of how do we do this is how do we inspire curiosity from an early age? Because you cannot drive the desire to learn unless you've driven the desire for curiosity. And I think we skip that completely. So when you talk about the genetic lottery, I think almost all of the people in the room have, there's something called the curiosity quotient. I don't even know what that is. But if we use those terms, right, I think everybody in this room has a, has a very high level of that, but we don't drive that. And along with that is critical thinking.
I will say just, by the way, if people want to raise their hand if they have a question, but there are people in the room who are tapped into networks that are dealing with folks at that level, and happy to welcome thoughts from you as well.
My name is Dan Whaley. I wanted to zero in on a few things. First of all, I think that the evening is great, and the focus of the panel is wonderful. A couple things were said, in particular around companies like Uber, and perhaps Uber in particular. And I don't have a vested interest there, but one thing was said, which is that, oh, well, it was built around the sharing economy, but as soon as the automated car came around, well, clearly that was BS. I think that's unfair. I think that when Travis started Uber, the automated car really wasn't a thing, and it was built around the sharing economy. And I think Travis has got a lot of problems, and looks like maybe he's taking a rest for a while. But I think there is a deeper thing, which is that the pace of change is happening so rapidly that we're forming in theses around opportunities and pursuing them as entrepreneurs, which I'm sure many of the people in the audience are. And how do we, because Paul was the guy that said it's CEOs that are the problem, right? They're the ones that are stealing the jobs. So how, if you are indicting CEOs who are trying to wrap opportunities and bring funding to opportunities, and probably in their hearts really want to do something that makes a difference to people, then what is the guidance that you give people who are trying to make an impact, bring capital to problems, and who are riding the tip of this crazy spear, which is extraordinary disruption, and parts of which may involve things like automation and so forth. And I think it's, I don't know if indicting CEOs is the wrong thing. There's a deeper paradigm that's going on here that we need to all reflect upon and think about.
So I don't mean to be overly hard on CEOs. They have people they report to, they're called shareholders. At the end of the day, it's why I emphasized empathy. At the end of the day, really, it's like that Pogo cartoon from the 1960s where Pogo's standing there saying, we have met the enemy and he is us. I remember a conversation I had with the CEO of one of the Bell operating companies some years ago, and I was an arrogant young consultant type, and I said, well, this is what you have to do, this, this, and this. And he looked at me like I was an idiot, which I was. And he says, my problem is that way. And I said, what do you mean that way? And he was facing north. He says, all my shareholders are retirees in Florida. And if I do what you do, I'm going to miss probably 4 to 6 quarters of profitability, and I won't last long enough to finish my job. So while I pointed to CEOs for the sake of brevity, at the end of the day, we're all part of this problem. That's why, if I had to pick one thing to do, we need to use social media to create new kinds of empathy engines that help people understand the big impact of small actions. And we might start with voting. Who knows? Call me old-fashioned.
My name is Michael Glopter. I'm the author of a recent book called Lean Startups for Social Change. I work a lot on innovation and social change. I'm interested, not to change the subject, but it strikes me that it's one of the central, and I've worked for many years on the field of sustainability, and a perennial debate is how hard people work. And so when we say the future of independent workers, the question is, what are we working for? Right? A big piece of what's happening is the returns on capital are rapidly outstripping the returns on labor more than ever, and also similar to like the last big boost around the last Great Depression. And back then there were huge debates about the end of work, right? Was capital become so effective that we no longer have to work? We clearly are in an era, again, where that looks like a possibility. So some of the future of work has to do with how much money do you have to make? Not universal basic income, but how are the costs of goods, what's the relationship of capital to production and to labor, such that that balance is shifted so that maybe people do in fact work 25 hours a week. They work less to get the same value. Investors, CEOs make less as a result. So there's kind of a flip side to this question, which is what work for what? how much money, how many goods, at what price, and what return to the markets for our labor and for our capital. I'll give you just a quick example. I'm in the middle of a calculation. It looks like you could pretty much, if you look at how much the US government spent on freeways, building freeways, you may be able to use about the same amount of money to build solar that powers the whole country for free, like freeways are quote unquote free, right? That changes the cost of energy radically. Things like that are starting to happen.
Just one comment on what you were talking about. Reed Keynes, his article, that was his forecast that the world we would be in by now was that world of the people's desires would be fulfilled in 20 hours or less. And it's the one part of his article he got wrong.
He got it wrong. So, as of yet.
Well,
Okay,
he gave us, you know, a smart forecaster will either predict, they'll say this is what will happen, or they'll say this is when it will happen. But if you're really smart, this is the secret to forecast. Never say both. Either say what or when. Well, Keynes said both, so he gave us a time and we passed it.
Did you have a quick? You also had a quick?
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, I think that I completely agree with that in the longer term, and we do have to start somewhere, even in the current workplace, of listening to what people want and need now. There's reasons why people will vote to have more work flexibility or shorter commutes or work from home over more money. And I think that's a promising seed to grab here as we look at how we change our definitions of what's important to us and why we work.
You've been a quick
So
one?
the one thing I was going to add into all of this, I grew up down in Salinas. So every day, sure as hell not my family, but I'd watch people go out, and I did spend a summer doing this, where you show up 2 hours before your shift starts, you don't get paid for any of it, you drive out to wherever you're going to go pick whatever you're picking, you work 15 hours, you get no overtime, you don't get paid for the 2 hours back where they dump you, not at your house, but at the site. And this is the on-demand economy I grew up in, or at least surrounded by. People shouldn't, I mean, I believe in the idealism of a lot of the room. People shouldn't be bent over in a field 15 hours a day. They shouldn't. And in fact, I have some friends that have, several of them, working in the precision farming. So this is AI for agriculture. It is amazing what it can do. But you will have this entire population of people. And I'm not clear on how the economics of this works out, such that they are now no longer tied down to the land, that somehow the productivity increase of the kinds of people I went to private high school with down in Salinas gets transferred back into their lives. I don't see that at all. Is it possible, conceivable as a public policy decision, but not in this political climate. So how this sort of stuff really plays out, I think, is not that it's going to be one way or another, but it's going to be based on the choices we make about how these productivity gains actually get shared. And if they're shared the way they're currently shared, then I see a lot of people doing subsistence farming. I see a lot of people carrying technology around essentially in a service industry. But I see very, very few people working in the creative class, which is what I think we're all envisioning this economy will drive us towards. And I have problems with the economics of that split, as well as the sort of the fundamentals of how we educate and build people to be a part of that world.
Catherine, and then right back there too.
Hi, my name is Catherine Fulton. I'm proudly a member of the flexible independent working class now. Spent about 40 years either writing the stories of or helping people to create social change and in a period of reflection about how change is changing. I actually just want to stir something different into the mix, which is that there's both the practical and policy issue for people living in the transition, as well as where the destination is. And there is a world of pain in this transition. If you're 49 years old or 55 years old and you lose the job you've had for your life, and you know, retraining and retooling and moving someplace else looks really different. And a lot of the politics and policy of the country in the near term is going to be driven by the transition, not the destination, right? And so I think it's really important in a room like this that we extend that empathy that Paul is talking about to the people for whom the horizon is close and really tough, really depressing and really hard, and what that does to the politics and the policy solutions. So we need solutions for the transition as well as for the destination. So there's a management of this time frame. In all the speed up of change stuff, I think we forget the people who are going to be lost in the transition.
I thought there was, as related to the election, not that there was one cause of anything, but there was a great interview that NPR did where they went to West Virginia and they interviewed a bunch of coal miners, or really they aren't coal miners because they hadn't really worked in 10 years. And I love what they said, one after another during these interviews. I'm a registered Democrat, I haven't really worked in 10 years. I am sick of people telling me they're gonna retrain me into another job. They've been promising that for 10 years, and I'm still out of work. I don't think he can do it, but Donald Trump at least promised me that I'd get my coal mining job back, so I voted for him. And this idea that we're going to retrain coal miners into being software programmers, I actually, again, I'm going to pull the expert thing here. I have some friends that build AIs, so I'm not so clear that we will need that kind of frontline software programmer within 5 years, just as a concrete example, where I think there's a total misalignment between like 6-week job retraining programs deployed in these populations and what they actually need to go through the transition.
Okay, go ahead.
If any of the students from my classes at Stanford were here, they'd look out in the room and say, "You all are like unimaginably old and unimaginably antique."
Okay, so I'm Amy Wilkinson. I'm the author of an entrepreneurship book called The Creator's Code, and I teach at Stanford Business School. So my question is for Sarah and others on the panel, but given your experience managing a distributed workforce, what advice do you have for people doing that? When you're not seeing your colleagues every day, when you're not in a geographic, workspace, how do you sort of make that efficient, effective, and really positive for people?
Well, there's a lot of different answers in some ways for different size companies. Our company is a remote company, and when I started it, there were no resources to figure this out. I think a lot of companies struggle through it, and it doesn't work. They do casual flex, as we jokingly call it, and that can backfire really quickly. So actually, a couple years ago, we started a branch of Flex Jobs called Remote.co that's an online resource for resources where we've interviewed over 100 companies to share their tips and tricks and challenges and pros and cons and all of it on how and why they do it. We work with big companies, Fortune 500s, all the way down to entrepreneurial organizations. And I think that the biggest things are assessing what KPIs are, what are the ROIs and actual, all those acronyms that you are looking for to measure productivity in your workers, and to stop having lazy management of face time. Because in this day and age, when we say you're working on site, and I referenced, not to pick on Yahoo, but it was a big one at the time, that they were banning telecommuting, while at the same time in a similar email in that same week that they're hyping that they're giving iPhone 5s to their new employees. Is that so they can work on site, or is that so they can work when they're not at the office? I think the hypocrisy going on around remote work is going to hurt companies in the end, and it's going to hurt their competitiveness. And so I think that companies really should look at how they measure productivity and gauge what types of flexibility, remote and otherwise, can work for their teams. Same thing with freelance. I mean, it ties into freelance work as well. What roles are actually freelance roles and which ones are not? And kind of work with managers to train and to have strategies around those that are appropriate.
I'm Paul Singh. I've been an entrepreneur for the last few years, and now helping other entrepreneurs, as a startup mentor. So I want to talk about, Paul, some of the things you raised. I mean, I think, saying that our democracy is by people, for people is kind of a misnomer. I think it's been by corporations, for corporations for the longest time. No, I'm just saying that that's the saying. But today, realistically, for the last 20 years, our economy, at least if not 20, maybe even longer, it's always been by corporations, for corporations. And it is getting worse and worse because corporations have a bigger control because of the money. But we are always looking for policy solutions from Washington. So should we instead be looking for policy solutions from the corporations now that 5 of the biggest companies are here in the Valley and probably more forward-looking? Is this where we should be looking?
Actually, well, go ahead, but I know John.
I'm not taking the mic from Paul Sappho.
No. John, I know you've talked to me that big companies potentially have the potential to lead here, which is interesting.
You put that in your open. I think there's an absolute incumbent responsibility, particularly on tech companies, to take the responsibility attendant with the power that they currently have. I mean, it's the most extraordinary concentration of power ever in the history of ever. It just is. I mean, you didn't put the other companies up there, but there's big companies like that in China. There's big companies like that in other places as well. But the United States model is the most steroidal. And when we talked about Travis and Uber and all of that, you know, when the shift really did happen, and he goes, "Wow, I guess I could replace all my drivers with AI," you know, he's like, "Dude, the profits, right?" That approach to how we measure the value corporations put back into society, the shareholder measure, is insane. It's literally insane. And we hired someone who is insane in that way to be president. Maybe we needed to have an insane break in order to realize we have to rethink the social contract between business and society. We have to. And I think it's happening, and people have been writing and talking and thinking about it for centuries, ever since it's been a thing. But it's time. We have to create metrics where those other values that one of you mentioned, you know, the value to employee, the value to society, the value to other stakeholders, to partners, are measured as easily as shares that go up and down, right? And that is integrated into that value so that, you know, people can tune their engine of capitalism to the values that they have, whether they're, I want my employees to be happier, I want my community to be healthier, I want this or that or the other thing. And we just have to have a policy decision or a discussion around that. Fortunately, it is happening in other places. It is happening in companies. When the immigration ban went down, the 5 general counsels of those companies got together over the weekend and missed the Super Bowl to write a response to it that ended up pretty much stopping it dead. That has to happen more and more, I think, and will. But there are other places it's going to happen. Local government is... Yeah. No. Actually, I think if you talk to Brad Smith at Microsoft or the general counsel of Facebook, I think they did it because they thought it was the right thing to do. And yeah, their bottom line was threatened. That has to be, it can't be one or the other, it has to be all. Anyways, Paul.
Okay. Actually,
I would just want to say it would be great if we saw a concept like employee lifetime value optimized in the same way that so many of us are trying to optimize our customer lifetime value.
Let's do one last question here, and then we're going to take a break. Go ahead.
So, this is a comment and a question. Earlier, we mentioned that, you know, by 2030, 50% of the workforce will be freelance workforce or independent workers. At the same time, by 2030, 54% of the working age workforce will be people of color. So I just wanted us to kind of acknowledge the truth about who we're talking about, because that's less than 15 years from now. And the majority of kids in school right now are already kids of color. And so I think if we're asking the question about how do we build an economy that works for our future, we might want to make sure that we have some of that, you know, diversity reflected in the people offering solutions. And so my other question to that is also about the economy, and if we are on the track that we're currently on politically, and even in the conversations that we're having now, where we can't seem to see, you know, who we're talking about, I am wondering who are going to be the purchasers, who are going to be the consumers in that economy as well, and how does that play out in this conversation?
And could you just identify yourself?
Oh, I'm Alexander Bastian. I'm Policynic.
Awesome. Anybody have a thought on that?
Well, I do a lot of work. I have an upcoming book called The Tax on Being Different, and where we look at large-scale data and machine learning applied to issues of bias and diversity. I have to say, I don't see how it doesn't get worse in a free-for-all, unstructured economy. There's no good reason to think that these things won't become more of a problem. It really wasn't the topic, so I didn't bring it up, but I think everything about what you're saying is on point. And to tie it to someone else's earlier question about how do you run a distributed team, one of the #1 predictors of team success is team-level trust. And it's incredibly hard to build trust in highly diverse teams or in highly dispersed teams. And so we have to really think about how do we do that? How do we facilitate the ability of us to have human relationships over distance scales, over language, cultural, and basic racial divides? And sometimes it's phenomenally hard. I don't think there's any sugarcoating on this. These aren't things that have simple solutions. But throwing out another question for the crowd, even if maybe the color scheme here doesn't lend itself to it, is how do we actually promote diversity in a world where there's very, very limited accountability?
Please repeat the title of your book more slowly.
Oh, the tax on being different.
All right, well, that is something to mull in a 10-minute break. Part of the thing here is to connect with people around you. We're going to have 10 minutes, and we're going to do our little clicker here. And then when we come back, we're going to have another crew here, have a conversation, then we're all going to have some chance to talk in small groups. Thank you.